From the News Channel 5 Network, this is SportsLine.
Hey there, SportsLine on your television. Steve Laban here with you. Glad you are here with us on this Monday night, President's Day, on News Channel 5 Plus. We will have phone lines open tonight, 737-7767, if you want to jump in on the program. We will also hear from Titans coach, now permanent head coach, Mike Mularkey, coming up in just a few minutes. John sat down with him last week, so we'll get into that conversation. Some interesting stuff, some funny stuff as well from the head coach, so that'll be a good conversation. Then at the bottom of the hour, we will talk to Lipscomb men's basketball coach Casey Alexander. The Bisons very much below the radar this season. Josh Williams, one of their best players, got hurt fairly early on with a torn ACL. They actually started the year 4-16, just kind of completely out of the picture, and it looked like very much a lost season for Casey's club in Lipscomb. Well, they've now won 6 of their last 8, and last weekend they beat 2 teams in Jacksonville and North Florida that are tied at the top of the Atlantic Sun Conference now. North Florida, the team that was in the NCAA tournament a year ago. Everybody believes they're the team to beat again this year. Lipscomb beat them on Saturday. And now the Bison sit just 1 game back in the Atlantic Sun Conference race behind those 2 teams to try to win the regular season title, and certainly in position where they could maybe make some noise when it comes to the Atlantic Sun tournament as well. So just a remarkable turnaround from the Bisons, and we'll talk to Casey about what's been the key here, what has led to their offensive success, and what his team's chances are down the stretch. 3 games left in the regular season, and of course the Atlantic Sun tournament, wherever that may be in early March, and a lot of that will be determined by what happens here down the stretch of the regular season. The Predators at home tonight, taking on the first place Dallas Stars. Craig Smith, an early goal, well, about midway through the first period actually, for the Preds, who were pouncing early on pucks. And even the goal itself was a good sign for this Predators team, because it was a rebound goal in front of the net by Smith. We haven't seen a lot of those this year and lately from this Preds team. When they get rebound goals, all of a sudden they become much more difficult to beat. It's the traffic in front. We've heard it before. They get a lot of shots, but too often they're perimeter shots. It's finding that traffic in front and being able to get the greasy goals that they talk about. They can be so important. They got one tonight, and they lead Dallas 1-0 as they're just getting set to drop the puck for the second period over at Bridgestone Arena. It's been weird lately for the Predators. They have lost 5 of their last 7 games in Smashville, where normally they've got a great home ice advantage. That hasn't been the case here. But meanwhile, they've gone over a month now since they've lost a game in regulation away from home. Couple losses in overtime during that stretch, but they swept the Western Canada road trip. 4 wins there right before the All-Star break. They win at Florida Saturday night after losing in overtime to Tampa on Friday. You've got another overtime loss in there way back in Winnipeg in early January that starts the streak. But for over a month now, this team has won or got a point everywhere they've gone on the road, but yet they've struggled for some reason in Bridgestone Arena. And that is something they've got to change as they try to make a run here in the second half of the season and really fight for playoff position and ensure the fact that they get into the playoffs. 737-7767 is the number. We can talk about that. We can talk about the Titans, the offseason. We're getting ready for training camp, or the NFL training combine, scouting combine, coming up in a couple of weeks. Then free agency, of course, and the draft. We'll take your questions on that as well tonight. But one other thing I want to get into here, because I think it has been water cooler talk around the country over the last few days, is the article that was in the New York Daily News this weekend, written by Sean King, which essentially brings up the fact that Peyton Manning was involved in an incident at the University of Tennessee 20 years ago, back in 1996. That story, or at least the incident, was also portrayed or included in this class action lawsuit claiming a culture of sexual abuse amongst athletes at the University of Tennessee, which was filed last week here in the city of Nashville. I can't speak to the culture necessarily about Tennessee. Obviously, there have been a few more instances than people would like, for sure. The story in the football program currently that involves A.J. Johnson and Michael Williams is certainly a scary story. It is a disturbing story, and they are going to have their day in court. But the Peyton Manning thing this weekend really troubles me because, to me, it seems like it is very much low-hanging fruit for someone out there to find a guy like Peyton who is going out on top. We'll assume for the moment anyway that the Super Bowl was his final game and he will retire as a Super Bowl champion. He's beloved, not just in Tennessee or where he grew up in New Orleans, but really around the country after the career he's had. He's a $1 million endorsement guy for multiple different companies, and has basically been beyond reproach. Now, does that mean he's never made a mistake in his life or done anything wrong? Absolutely not. I wouldn't allege that, and I'd like for you to show me the person who is. I think it's pretty clear that Peyton did something that was wrong 20 years ago. And that should be part of the record. People understand that. But I think this is really weak journalism to go out and write a story 20 years after the fact, like Sean King did, and basically propose it as if it's new information. He was trying to essentially take the side of Cam Newton and saying that people writing him for the way he acted after the game was inappropriate and uncalled for because there are worse things out there. Just take a look across the field at the winning quarterback and this awful thing he did 20 years ago. And I got a problem with that. I mean, 20 years ago, it was a big story. I wasn't here then, but I've talked to several people who said at the time it was a story that was covered nonstop. There were columns written, there were stories written, the media was all over it to see what would be made of the Manning incident at Tennessee. It was settled at that point on campus. The sides decided to sign a non-disclosure agreement, and so they basically decided they wouldn't talk about it, and the case was settled at that point. A few years later, the trainer decided that something was wrong there, went to file a lawsuit against Manning and his dad. That ultimately was settled. It was covered then. It was covered at that point. It was covered when he was drafted. It was covered in 2003, then again in 2005 when something else, another tentacle of this story came up. But the story's been gone now for 10 or 11 years. Doesn't erase it from the record by any means, but I find it a little shady from a journalistic perspective to bring it up and essentially try to do a smear campaign on Manning at this point just to get a few clicks, just to get a few headlines. Or the other thing in play here is to promote a narrative. And the narrative that this particular writer has done several times is talk about race relations and essentially how they play out and white privilege and all of that stuff. I don't think that has anything to do with this story. Peyton Manning did a dumb thing 20 years ago, a really dumb thing. There's absolutely no defense for it. But he was scrutinized at the time. He has been scrutinized multiple times after the story has basically played itself out. At this moment, right after he gets off the pedestal of winning a Super Bowl in his final game of what has been a great career that has been beyond reproach in the NFL, I don't think this is the place to throw that out. The only reason you do it, frankly, is for clicks and to promote a narrative that you need to create, essentially. And that's what Sean King was doing. And that is what I have the biggest problem with of this story, because it's gone viral. I mean, everybody has read the story. People have looked it up. They've gone to it. And that's what he wanted. He wanted something that would get everybody to go and read his narrative and follow his story. The only problem is he's promoting the narrative with something that happened 2 decades ago. I think we got to be better than that. I'm all for informed conversations, and I'm all for going where stories need to go. But to me, this was a pretty lazy attempt. And the other thing, just to go into it, too, is when you look at the case, there are a lot of things you can look at. You can look at what they talked about to the university in 1996 and sort of the documents that were closed around the non-disclosure agreement. You can then look at the 2003 hearing and all of that. And it also depends which side you go from. He basically takes, in the article, fact, the plaintiff's complaint. The interviews that her attorneys compiled from herself and from other people who are witnesses for them, he takes that as the court saying that's fact in the case. That is, by any legal standard, the best possible scenario of how the situation went down for the plaintiff in the case. The worst possible scenario for Manning or anybody else. That's one side of the story, truly. But there's also another side of the story. And there's other things to look at there. He didn't do a good job because that didn't help his story by any means. Be careful with those things. As journalists, be careful with those things as consumers of the story. Because there's more to it, especially when you're trudging up things that have been sealed and lawsuits that have been filed and decided and all those sort of things many, many years ago. 737-7767 is our number tonight. If you want to get in on that, other discussions, that is welcome. We will also hear from new Titans coach Mike Mularkey coming up. Casey Alexander, Lipscomb basketball coach, on the way as well. We're back after this with much more here on SportsLine.